In addition to all the automatic controls included by Genexus and the applications it generates, sometimes users request that we make some specific controls. In transactions, the rules that must be complied with, or the controls that we're asked to validate, are defined in the Rules section. If, for example, a requirement is not to allow storing of clients without a name, we have a rule called error that will enable us to avoid that. We type error, parentheses, and between single quotation marks we enter the text that we want to have displayed in the event that the user tries to leave a client name blank. We close the parentheses, and now we only have to indicate the condition that must be met for the text to be displayed. The condition is that the customer name attribute is empty, so we write if customer name, period, and here we select is empty. All the rules we state must end with a semicolon, so we include it. We save, and press F5 to see this rule executed at runtime. We run the customer transaction, and if we leave the client name blank and leave the field, the text we defined is displayed. The error rule doesn't allow us to move on if the condition continues to be met, so the user either enters a client name to be able to continue or cancels. Note that if we try to click on the client's surname, the message stays on screen because the condition continues to be met. We enter a name, and see that we can continue entering the rest of the client's details. If another requirement involved prevents the client's surname from being left blank, a similar rule would also have to be stated. So we copy and paste this rule definition. And we replace name with last name to change the attribute involved. We press F5. Run customer, and leave the client's name empty. The error associated with the blank name is displayed. So we enter Paul, and try to leave the surname empty, and the error associated with the blank surname is displayed. There's another rule whose syntax is very similar to that of the error rule. It's called message. And the only difference with error is that if the condition is met, the message is displayed as a notice or warning, and the user can continue working. In other words, it doesn't prevent users from moving on, like the error rule does. If, for example, we want to inform that the client's phone number has been left blank without forcing the user to enter it, we can create a message rule, parentheses, and enter the text between single or double quotation marks. The phone is empty. We close the parentheses, and next we define the condition for the rule to be executed. If customer phone, period, is empty, and we type a semicolon to complete the rule definition. We press F5 to try this functionality. Note that if we leave the phone blank and try to leave the field, the message that we created is displayed. In this case, it's orange and we can keep working. So, let's suppose that our users at the travel agency have told us that they're interested in storing the date on which each customer is added. So we need to create a new attribute in the customer transaction to store this date. We enter customer added date of date type, and now we would only have to automatically assign it today's date. We go to the rules section and select a rule called default. This rule allows us to start an attribute or variable with a value. This way, the syntax of the default rule has been inserted. Now we'll replace the attribute between the parentheses with the attribute that we want to initialize, which is customer added date. And we'll also add the value that we want it to use, which is today's date. Ampersand today is a predefined variable that always has today's date loaded in order to use it. Now we save, and press F5. We're now notified that the new attribute customer-added-date will be added to the customer table. We click on Reorganize. And once again, we have the application ready to be executed. We click on Customer. And we can see that the new Added Date attribute already begins with today's date. If we hadn't entered the default rule, the date field would be empty like the other fields. We enter a customer, Robert Hill, who lives on 81st Street. His phone number is 760-5100, and his email address is rhill@hotmail.com. And note that today's date is suggested, but we can change it. If the users at the travel agency were interested in allowing the date to be edited, preventing future dates from being entered, we could create an error rule. We open parentheses and type, "The date must be lower or equal than today." Close parentheses, and add the condition, if customer added date is greater than ampersand today. To try this at runtime, we press F5. We enter Alex Johnson, and if we try to enter a date higher than today, the condition that we defined is met and the associated error is displayed. Now let's suppose that our users at the travel agency have told us that the data client was added cannot be edited. It must be shown as disabled in the form and saved as suggested by the application. To meet this request, we would have to eliminate this rule, because it no longer makes sense. Also, we would have to define a new rule, no except. We replace the text attribute or variable between the parentheses with the attribute customer added date, and delete if condition, because we want this rule to always be executed. Now, let's try this behavior. F5. And as we can see, the date is initialized by the default rule and disabled by the no except rule. Something important to note here and learn is that the order in which rules are defined doesn't necessarily match the order in which they will be executed. This set of rules could be stated in any other order, and the results at runtime would be exactly the same, because Genexus decides when each one of the defined rules should be triggered. To finish up, remember that each transaction may need to have its own behavior rules defined. In this case, we've defined rules in the client's transaction to check the behavior that we were asked to control when users interact with the client's details. Most likely, the agency wants to control certain rules or behaviors for attractions as well, or for another transaction. To this end, each transaction has its own set of rules.